There is a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that lay undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. It was sealed behind a stairway no one thought to search for, in a valley that had already been picked over by robbers, scholars, and treasure hunters for centuries. When it was finally opened in 1922, what struck the excavators first was not any single object. It was the sheer density of ordinary things pressed into that small space: chairs, chests, jars of food, folded linen, a chariot dismantled to fit through the doorway. All of it had been prepared with the same careful attention as the golden objects that would later make headlines around the world. The young king buried there was a minor ruler by the standards of his own dynasty. Yet he had been given a tomb meant to sustain him, in the Egyptian understanding of the word, forever. To understand why an entire civilization would organize so much of its labor, wealth, and imagination around the idea of a life that continued after death, it helps to begin somewhere else entirely. Not in a tomb, but beside a river, in a landscape where survival depended on predicting a flood that arrived, with remarkable but not perfect regularity, once every year. Egypt, as a geographic fact before it was ever a civilization, is really the story of a single river running through an otherwise inhospitable stretch of desert. The Nile flows northward for well over 4,000 miles, gathering its waters from the highlands of East Africa. By the time it reaches what is now Egypt, it has carved a narrow green corridor through land that receives almost no rainfall at all. On either side of this corridor lies desert. The boundary between the two is often so sharp that a person can stand with one foot on cultivated soil and the other on barren sand. Each year, historically, rains far to the south swelled the river until it overflowed its banks across the Egyptian floodplain. It deposited a fresh layer of dark, mineral-rich silt across the fields before receding again. This natural cycle of renewal made the narrow valley extraordinarily fertile, without requiring the kind of irrigation labor that shaped civilizations elsewhere. The ancient Egyptians themselves seem to have understood their dependence on this cycle with unusual clarity. They divided their year into 3 seasons named directly for its stages: the flood, the growing season that followed as the waters receded, and the harvest. Nearly everything about how Egyptian society organized itself grew out of this single dominant rhythm. Its calendar, its religious festivals, its administrative record-keeping, even its sense of order versus chaos. By around 5000 BCE, small farming communities had established themselves along the Nile's banks, growing wheat and barley and raising cattle. This was the kind of settled village life that, across the ancient world, tends to come before more complex political organization. Over the following centuries, these communities grew larger and more numerous. A pattern familiar from other early river valley civilizations began to take shape. Villages consolidated into larger settlements. Local leaders emerged to manage the practical business of coordinating flood-dependent agriculture and resolving disputes over land. By the 4th millennium BCE, Egypt had come to be organized into 2 loosely distinct cultural and political zones. Later, Egyptians called them Upper Egypt, the southern stretch of the Nile Valley, and Lower Egypt, the broad, marshy delta where the river fans out into the Mediterranean Sea. This division into 2 lands, Upper and Lower, would remain a foundational idea in Egyptian political thought for the rest of the civilization's history. The pharaoh's formal titles and the very crown he wore reflected his claim to rule over both regions as one. The unification of these two lands into a single kingdom is traditionally credited to a ruler named Nama, sometimes identified with a figure called Menes in later tradition. It is usually dated to around 3100 BCE. Later, Egyptians treated it as the true beginning of their civilization's history, the moment order was first imposed on a divided land. It depicts a king wearing, on one side, the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other, the red crown of Lower Egypt, striking down enemies in a pose of ritual conquest. That pose would be repeated with only minor variation on royal monuments for the next 3,000 years. Whether the unification itself came from a single decisive conquest, as the palette's imagery suggests, or from a longer and messier process that later tradition compressed into one dramatic moment, remains a genuine question among historians. The honest answer is that the archaeological evidence supports a more gradual process than the later legend implies, even if a culminating military campaign under a ruler like Nama was the final decisive step. What followed this unification is generally described by historians as the early dynastic period. It spans roughly the first two ruling dynasties and lasted several centuries. During this time, the basic institutions of a unified Egyptian state took shape. A capital was established at Memphis, near the point where the Nile Valley opens into the delta, a natural center for governing both halves of the newly joined kingdom. A system of writing, hieroglyphic script, was already sophisticated enough by this period to record royal names, administrative transactions, and religious formulas. And a concept of kingship took hold that fused political authority with religious significance in a way that would remain distinctive to Egyptian civilization throughout its history. The Egyptian king would only later come to be commonly known by the title pharaoh, originally a word for the royal palace itself before it gradually came to mean its occupant. He was understood not merely as a political ruler in the way a king might be understood elsewhere. Egyptians saw him as a living embodiment of the god Horus, and as the essential intermediary responsible for maintaining a concept the Egyptians called Maat. That word carries connotations of truth, balance, and cosmic order, standing against the ever-present threat of Isfet, or chaos. This was not an abstract philosophical position. Egyptians appear to have truly believed that the natural world depended, in some real sense, on the king properly fulfilling his ritual and political obligations. The reliable arrival of the annual flood, the movement of the sun, the general stability of society, all of it. The royal burial ground at Abydos offers its own window into how quickly royal burial customs grew complex in these opening centuries. It was used by Egypt's earliest kings before the center of royal funerary architecture shifted first to Memphis and later to Giza. Excavations there, conducted across more than a century by successive teams of archaeologists, have uncovered a sequence of increasingly elaborate tomb complexes belonging to First and Second Dynasty kings. Several are surrounded by rows of smaller subsidiary graves containing servants, craftsmen, and even dwarfs and dogs. Their skeletal remains show no signs of violent struggle, but their simultaneous burial alongside the king strongly suggests a practice of retainer sacrifice. Members of the royal household were put to death, or perhaps died willingly, according to a belief system that treated such a death as an honor, so that they might continue serving their ruler in the next life. This practice, disturbing as it appears to modern sensibilities, seems to have been abandoned within a few generations. It was replaced instead by small carved statuettes and painted tomb scenes of servants at work, which served the same symbolic purpose for the rest of Egyptian history. Some historians read this as an early example of Egyptian religious thought working out, through trial and revision, less costly solutions to the same underlying problem: how a king's household might accompany him into eternity. Beyond Abydos, this same period also saw the crystallization of a formal royal titulary. Its essential structure would remain unusually stable for the following 3,000 years. There was a Horus name, linking the king to that falcon god of kingship, a Nibi name invoking two protective goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, a golden Horus name, a throne name adopted at accession, and finally a birth name, the personal name given at birth and the one most familiar to modern readers. Tutankhamun and Ramesses are examples of this last category, rather than a king's full formal identity as it would have appeared on a temple wall. This elaborate naming convention, seemingly excessive to modern eyes, reflects a wider Egyptian conviction that a name carried real power and real risk. To record a name correctly was to help sustain the person or being it belonged to, and to omit, damage, or replace a name was a meaningful act. This happened to Akhenaten, and for different political reasons, to Hatshepsut. Egyptians believed such an act carried consequences into the eternal realm their kings were destined to inhabit. This distinctive understanding of kingship helps explain one of the most striking features of early Egyptian civilization: the exceptional investment of labor and resources in royal tombs. That investment reached its most dramatic expression during the period historians call the Old Kingdom, spanning roughly the 3rd through 6th dynasties, from around 2686 to 2081 BCE. Early Egyptian kings had been buried in relatively modest mud brick structures called mastabas, low rectangular buildings with sloped sides. But during the 3rd dynasty, an official named Imhotep, serving under a king called Djoser, designed something altogether new. He built a tomb, not as a single mastaba, but as a series of 6 mastabas stacked in decreasing size atop one another. This created the world's first monumental stone building, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Imhotep himself would later be remembered by the Egyptians with an almost unique degree of reverence for a non-royal individual. He was eventually deified in later periods as a god of wisdom, medicine, and architecture, a sign of how significant this innovation was understood to be in a civilization that rarely elevated commoners to such status. The architectural experimentation that followed Djoser's step pyramid culminated within just a few generations in the construction of true smooth-sided pyramids. That development unfolded very quickly. Within roughly a century of Imhotep's stepped design, Egyptian builders working under the 4th dynasty king Sneferu had progressed through several further experiments. One pyramid at Medum appears to have partially collapsed either during or shortly after construction. Another at Dahshur, now known as the Bent Pyramid, had its angle apparently altered partway through construction, likely in response to structural concerns. That change gave the finished monument its distinctive shift in slope roughly halfway up its height. Sneferu's engineers eventually succeeded in building a true pyramid with consistent angles at Dahshur as well, now known as the Red Pyramid for the color of its exposed stone. This hard-won engineering knowledge then passed to Sneferu's son, Khufu. He used it to build the largest pyramid ever built in Egypt, the Great Pyramid at Giza, completed around 2560 BCE. At its original height, it stood somewhat over 480 feet, a height no human structure anywhere in the world would surpass for well over 3,500 years. The scale of this achievement invites a natural question. How was it actually accomplished? The honest answer, built from decades of archaeological work at Giza, differs a great deal from the popular image of enslaved masses driven by the whip. Excavations of a nearby workers' settlement have revealed evidence of an organized labor force. Workers were housed, fed, and medically treated in a manner consistent with a rotating system of conscripted labor. Most were likely drawn from the farming population during the months when the Nile's flood made agricultural work impossible anyway. A smaller core of permanent skilled craftsmen supplemented them, including stonemasons, carpenters, and engineers, working under state organization and paid in rations of bread, beer, and meat. This does not mean the work was easy or the conditions comfortable. Evidence of significant physical strain and injury appears in the skeletal remains recovered from the workers' cemetery nearby. But it does complicate the older assumption of mass slavery. What emerges instead is a highly organized state project, drawing on national labor and resources in a manner not unlike a large public works program. Behind it lay genuine religious conviction about the stakes of properly equipping a deceased king for his continued existence. The Giza Plateau itself, beyond the 3 great pyramids most associated with it today, developed during this period into an enormous integrated funerary complex. Each pyramid was accompanied by its own mortuary temple, where daily offerings were maintained for the deceased king's spirit by dedicated priests, supported through land endowments set aside for this ongoing purpose. A causeway connected this mortuary temple to a further valley temple nearer the Nile, where the king's body would have been received and ritually purified before burial. Around them lay satellite cemeteries of smaller mastaba tombs, arranged in careful rows. Members of the royal family and high officials sought burial as close as possible to their king, hoping to share, through proximity, in the same continued existence the pyramid was built to secure. It was also during Khafre's reign, Khufu's son and the builder of the second Giza pyramid, that the Great Sphinx was carved. This colossal recumbent lion with a human head is generally understood to represent the king himself. It was cut directly from a single outcrop of bedrock left over from the pyramid quarrying operations and positioned to gaze eastward across the Nile Valley. Despite its towering fame, the monument's original name and full ritual function within the wider Giza complex remain incompletely understood. Surviving Old Kingdom texts say strikingly little about it directly, leaving much of its interpretation to inference from its physical position and later periods of religious veneration. Beyond the pyramids themselves, the Old Kingdom established administrative patterns that would persist, with modification, for the remainder of Egyptian history. A centralized bureaucracy was staffed by scribes trained in the demanding hieroglyphic script, and, for everyday purposes, the more efficient cursive hieratic script. A system of regional governors called nomarchs oversaw the roughly 40 administrative districts, or nomes, into which Egypt was divided. And an economy took shape, organized around the collection and redistribution of agricultural surplus, with grain stored in state and temple granaries. This grain served as a buffer against poor flood years. It was also the practical basis for paying laborers, officials, and craftsmen who worked directly for the crown or the temples, rather than through anything resembling a market economy in the modern sense. The writing system that made this apparatus possible deserves some attention of its own, since it represents one of ancient Egypt's most distinctive and enduring achievements. Hieroglyphic script was already well developed by the time of Nama's unification, and remained in continuous use for the following 3,500 years. It combined several different principles at once. Some signs represented whole words or ideas directly. Others represented individual consonantal sounds, functioning much like an alphabet. Still others served as unspoken classifying marks, clarifying the category of meaning intended by an otherwise ambiguous group of sound signs. The result was a system significantly more flexible and far more difficult for a non-specialist to learn than a true alphabet would have been. This complexity meant that literacy remained restricted throughout Egyptian history to a relatively small trained class, generally estimated by modern scholars at under 10% of the population. It was concentrated heavily among scribes, priests, and administrative officials. For them, a lengthy formal education, often beginning in early childhood and continuing for years within dedicated scribal schools attached to temples or the royal court, was required before genuine fluency could be achieved. For everyday administrative purposes, where speed mattered more than the formal, carefully carved elegance appropriate to a temple wall, scribes generally used a cursive, simplified version of the hieroglyphic signs known as hieratic. It was written quickly in ink on papyrus, a paper-like material made from the pith of a reed plant that grew abundantly in the Nile's marshy margins. It is through the survival of hieratic administrative documents, tax records, legal contracts, personal letters, and literary texts, far more than through formal hieroglyphic inscriptions, that modern historians have reconstructed so much of the everyday functioning of Egyptian bureaucracy and daily life. The religious framework underpinning this entire system shaped virtually every dimension of Old Kingdom society, from the organization of labor to the layout of the landscape itself. Egyptian religion during this period, as throughout most of pharaonic history, was not organized around a single coherent theology in the way later monotheistic traditions would be. It centered instead on a large and in places honestly inconsistent collection of local and national deities. Their relative importance shifted according to the political fortunes of the cities most closely associated with their worship. The sun god Ra, whose cult center at Heliopolis near modern Cairo achieved particular prominence during the Old Kingdom, came to be closely identified with kingship itself. Pharaohs from the 4th dynasty onward regularly adopted the title Son of Ra as part of their formal royal titulary. And solar imagery came to dominate royal funerary architecture for the rest of the Old Kingdom, most visibly the pyramid form itself. Many Egyptologists interpret it as a stylized representation of the sun's rays descending to Earth, or alternatively, as a physical staircase by which the deceased king might ascend to join the sun god in the sky. Alongside Re stood the god Osiris, associated with death, resurrection, and the fertile renewal brought by the Nile's flood. He governed a separate but closely related strand of belief about the afterlife. The deceased king, in a pattern that would persist and evolve across the following centuries, came to be identified with Osiris himself in death. His living successor, meanwhile, was identified with the god Horus, Osiris's mythological son. This theological structure gave a continuous religious justification for the orderly transfer of kingship from one generation to the next. The practical organization required to build the pyramids of Giza shows just how far this religious conviction translated into concrete administrative capacity. Modern archaeological and engineering analysis suggests that the Great Pyramid alone incorporates somewhat over 2 million individual limestone and granite blocks. Most were quarried locally at Giza itself. The finer casing stones that once covered the entire exterior, since eroded away or stripped for later building projects, came from quarries at Tura across the river. The massive granite blocks used in the pyramid's internal chambers were transported from quarries at Aswan, some 500 miles to the south. They were floated downriver on barges during the annual flood, when water levels were high enough to bring vessels close to the construction site itself. The precision achieved in the pyramid's construction is itself striking. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of a small fraction of a degree. Its base sits nearly perfectly level across a footprint of more than 13 acres. This was achieved without any of the metal tools, wheeled transport for heavy loads, or mathematical notation systems that later engineering traditions would rely upon. Builders instead used tools of copper and stone, wooden sledges dragged across specially prepared and, according to some evidence, deliberately dampened surfaces to reduce friction, and enough astronomical knowledge to establish true north through careful observation of circumpolar stars. This centralized system, however, carried within it the seeds of its own periodic breakdown, a pattern that would recur more than once across Egyptian history. Toward the end of the Old Kingdom, the power and independence of regional nomarchs appear to have grown steadily, likely at the expense of central royal authority. The trend is visible in the increasingly elaborate provincial tombs these officials built for themselves, far from the royal cemeteries at Giza and Saqqara. It was likely reinforced by the extraordinarily long reign of the 6th dynasty king Pepi II, traditionally credited with ruling for as much as 90 years. A span that long may well have let regional officials entrench hereditary local power to a degree far more difficult under a succession of shorter, more assertive reigns. This gradual political drift coincided with, and was very likely worsened by a series of unusually low Nile floods toward the very end of the Old Kingdom. Evidence for this survives both in Egyptian textual references to famine and in broader climate data, including ancient lake sediments and cave formations across northeastern Africa. Modern researchers see in this data a wider pattern of regional acidification, one that appears to have affected multiple ancient societies around the eastern Mediterranean during roughly the same period. It placed severe, sustained strain on an agricultural system that the entire Egyptian state and the redistributive economy built upon it depended on, absolutely. The result, by around 2181 BCE, was a collapse of centralized authority. Egypt fragmented into competing regional power centers, with rival dynasties claiming royal authority simultaneously from different cities, chiefly Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. Historians call this the First Intermediate Period. Later, Egyptian texts describe it in unmistakably bleak terms, invoking images of social breakdown, failed floods, and reversed fortune. Some of this literature was likely composed later, under rulers with an interest in dramatizing the chaos their own dynasties had supposedly overcome. Even so, the underlying picture of a fragmented and troubled Egypt during this century and a half appears to be largely accurate. Order was eventually restored through Theban military success. Rulers from that southern city gradually extended their control northward, culminating around 2055 BCE in the reunification of Egypt under a king named Mentuhotep II. His reign is conventionally taken to mark the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, a period lasting until roughly 1650 BCE. Alongside the Old Kingdom before it and the New Kingdom that would follow, it is generally regarded as one of the three great high points of ancient Egyptian civilization. The Middle Kingdom's rulers had witnessed firsthand the consequences of fragmented royal authority during the First Intermediate Period. They pursued a more cautious, deliberately balanced approach to governance than their Old Kingdom predecessors, working to curb the independent power of regional nomarchs. At the same time, they invested heavily in infrastructure, especially in the Fayum region southwest of the Nile Valley. There, an extensive program of irrigation and land reclamation, most associated with the 12th dynasty king Amenemhat III, expanded Egypt's cultivable land and created a substantial new agricultural region essentially from scratch. This was also a period of real literary achievement, one that tends to receive far less popular attention than Old Kingdom architecture or New Kingdom military campaigns, despite being significant in its own right. Middle Kingdom. Egypt produced a body of literature that later Egyptian scribes would continue to copy, study, and imitate for well over 1,000 years, treating these texts something like a classical canon. The story of Sinuhe is one example. It follows a court official who fled Egypt after the death of a king, built a new life among Semitic tribes in the Levant, and eventually returned home in his old age. It survives in numerous copies and remains one of the most sophisticated pieces of narrative prose from the ancient world, known for its psychological depth and its exploration of exile, identity, and the pull of one's homeland. Instructional texts formed another tradition. Structured as advice supposedly offered by an elder, often a father or a king, to a younger successor, they addressed practical wisdom on statecraft, personal conduct and the administration of justice. Scribes used these texts extensively in their own training, and their literature sometimes celebrated the scribal profession as superior to virtually every other occupation in Egyptian society. That self-promotion has nonetheless left modern historians with an unusually detailed picture of how literate Egyptians understood their own world. Middle Kingdom foreign policy focused heavily on Egypt's southern neighbor, Nubia, a region along the Nile rich in gold, ebony, ivory, and other trade goods. Nubia was also, at various points, a source of military manpower and, on occasion, a military threat. 12th Dynasty kings built an extensive chain of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in Lower Nubia, chiefly around the difficult rapids known as the Second Cataract. When archaeologists rediscovered these structures in the 20th century, their scale and sophistication revealed a level of military engineering well beyond what had generally been assumed for this period of Egyptian history. Elaborate defensive walls, garrison housing, and administrative buildings were designed to control and tax trade moving along this crucial southern corridor. 12th Dynasty kings, the same line responsible for the Fayum project and the Nubian fortress chain, also pioneered a distinctive approach to royal succession. Historians call it co-regency. A reigning king would formally elevate his chosen heir to share the throne and its royal titulary while the father was still alive and actively ruling, rather than waiting for a purely posthumous transfer of power. This arrangement is attested in dated inscriptions that record years counted simultaneously from both the senior and junior king's reigns. It let an heir gain direct governing experience and establish his own authority well before he would need to rule alone. It also reduced the period of dynastic uncertainty that had contributed to instability at the close of the Old Kingdom, and would later contribute again to difficulties at the close of the Middle Kingdom itself. The practice seems to have contributed meaningfully to the Middle Kingdom's comparative political stability across nearly 2 centuries. It also shows how directly Egyptian rulers of this period studied the failures of the order that had collapsed before them. Middle Kingdom rulers also reorganized Egypt's military capacity, a development that receives comparatively little popular attention but laid important groundwork for later imperial expansion. Old Kingdom military activity had relied largely on temporary levies, raised from the general population and organized regionally by individual nomarchs. This system mirrored the labor arrangements used for pyramid construction and left the crown dependent on local officials for its fighting strength. 12th Dynasty kings moved gradually toward a more centrally controlled military establishment instead. They maintained standing garrisons at strategic points, especially along the Nubian frontier, and drew increasingly on foreign mercenary troops, chiefly Nubian archers from the Medjay people. Their skill with the bow made them prized as soldiers in Egyptian service. In later periods, they also formed a distinct professional class tied to policing and security functions within Egypt itself, a role the term Medjay would continue to carry long after its original ethnic association had faded. The great fortress chain built along the Second Cataract was garrisoned by these more permanent forces, supplied through a dedicated administrative system for provisioning troops stationed far from the agricultural heartland of the Nile Valley. It was also equipped with sophisticated defensive features, including projecting bastions that let defenders fire along the length of the fortress walls. Trade and diplomatic contact extended well beyond Nubia during this period as well. Middle Kingdom Egypt maintained active commercial relationships across the eastern Mediterranean, chiefly with the Levantine coastal city of Byblos. Byblos supplied the cedar wood that Egypt's own timber. Poor landscape could not. Wood. Egyptian shipbuilders and craftsmen depended on for everything from temple doors to the great cedar funerary boats, sometimes buried alongside royal tombs. Egyptian expeditions during this period also pushed into the Sinai Peninsula in pursuit of turquoise and copper, and further south along the Red Sea coast for incense, myrrh, and other exotic trade goods. This pattern of foreign contact would recur throughout pharaonic history, foreshadowing the more famous expedition to Punt that Hatshepsut would later sponsor during the New Kingdom. The artistic culture of the Middle Kingdom also took on a character somewhat distinct from what had come before, especially in royal portraiture. Instead, they carved images with heavy-lidded eyes, deep furrows around the mouth, and an overall impression of weariness. Many modern viewers read this as a deliberate expression of the burdens of kingship, a visual statement that ruling Egypt and maintaining Ma'at against disorder was demanding, exhausting work, rather than an effortless divine privilege. Whether this reading fully captures the original intent behind these images remains debated. They may also reflect shifting artistic convention, or a genuine attempt at individual likeness rather than pure ideological statement. But the shift stands out sharply, set against the smooth, unlined royal faces of both the Old Kingdom before it and the New Kingdom after it. It has become one of the more discussed features of Middle Kingdom art. Specialists studying it see in these faces the anxieties of a dynasty that had come to power in the aftermath of the First Intermediate Period's collapse, and that remained alert to how quickly such disorder could return. The Middle Kingdom eventually gave way, as the Old Kingdom had before it, to a further period of fragmented central authority, the Second Intermediate Period, beginning around 1650 BCE. This new fragmentation differed from the earlier collapse in one significant way. Rather than fragmenting purely along internal regional lines, Egypt saw a foreign dynasty, known to the Egyptians as the Hyksos, take control of the Delta region in the north. They ruled from a capital at Avaris, while native Egyptian rulers continued to hold power in the south from Thebes. The Hyksos take their name from an Egyptian phrase meaning something like rulers of foreign lands. They appear to have originated in the region of the Levant. Their rise to power in Egypt seems to have occurred gradually, through immigration and settlement in the Delta, followed by an eventual assertion of independent political control. This was not the kind of single dramatic conquest that later, more hostile Egyptian sources tended to describe. Whatever the precise mechanism of their arrival, the Hyksos brought technologies that would prove enormously consequential for Egyptian warfare. Most significantly, the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. Egyptian forces had not previously possessed either. and native Egyptian rulers would eventually need to master both before they could hope to expel the dynasty that had introduced them. Excavations at Avaris itself, the Hyksos capital in the eastern delta, have revealed a thoroughly mixed material culture. Levantine-style architecture, burial customs, and imported pottery appear alongside distinctly Egyptian religious and administrative practices. This suggests that Hyksos rule, whatever resentment it provoked among the southern Theban rulers who eventually overthrew it, involved real cultural adaptation and exchange, rather than a simple imposition of foreign customs on a passive population. Later, more nationalistic Egyptian sources, composed after the Hyksos expulsion, tended to minimize this blending sharply, in favor of a starker story of foreign oppression and native liberation. That expulsion came under a Theban ruler named Ahmose. Around 1550 BCE, building on the military groundwork laid by his immediate predecessors, he drove the Hyksos out of Egypt entirely, pursuing them into their traditional territory in the southern Levant and reunifying Egypt under native rule. This victory marks the conventional beginning of the New Kingdom, spanning roughly the 18th through 20th dynasties and lasting until around 177 BCE. Egypt had absorbed the military lessons of its Hyksos experience and was now equipped with chariots, improved bronze weaponry, and an increasingly professionalized standing army. Over the course of this period, it transformed itself from a river valley kingdom focused mainly on its own internal affairs into an imperial power. It projected military and political influence across a wide swath of the eastern Mediterranean and northeastern Africa. The New Kingdom's early pharaohs pursued this expansion with real energy. None did so more effectively than a woman named Hatshepsut, who came to power initially as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. Around 1479 BCE, she assumed the full royal titulary and formal status of pharaoh in her own right, one of only a small handful of women to rule Egypt with unambiguous royal authority across the civilization's entire history. Rather than pursuing extensive military conquest, Hatshepsut's roughly 20-year reign is best known for ambitious building projects. Most spectacular is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs across the Nile from Thebes, with a striking terraced design unlike anything built before or after in Egyptian architecture. She also sponsored an expedition to a distant land the Egyptians called Punt, likely located somewhere along the coast of modern Eritrea, Djibouti, or Somalia. That expedition is commemorated in detailed relief carvings. They depict the exotic goods brought back: incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and animals unfamiliar to Egyptian audiences, along with the physical appearance of the Puntite people themselves. It offers modern historians one of the richest surviving records of Egyptian long-distance trade and diplomatic contact. Hatshepsut's position as a female ruler in a system of kingship built almost entirely around masculine imagery and precedent required careful ideological work. Her own monuments make this visible in a strikingly direct way. Early representations from her reign generally show her dressed in the traditional regalia of a queen. But as her rule progressed, she increasingly commissioned statuary and relief carving depicting herself in the full formal costume of a male pharaoh, including the traditional false ceremonial beard worn by kings as a symbol of royal authority. Inscriptions from her reign describe her divine birth as the daughter of the god Amun himself, language that closely echoed the way male rulers had traditionally established their own divine sanction, adapted rather than abandoned to fit her circumstances. Modern Egyptologists do not read this visual and textual program as evidence that Hatshepsut sought to disguise or deny her sex. Texts from her reign continue in places to use feminine grammatical forms when referring to her. Instead, it looks like a considered strategy for asserting that kingship itself, regardless of the office holder's sex, carried an unchanging set of divine and political attributes she was fully entitled to claim. Following her death, a systematic effort was made, apparently during the later part of Thutmose III's own reign, to remove her images and name from many of her monuments. Historians still debate the motivation. Some see an attempt to erase the precedent of female kinship. Others see a more routine assertion of Thutmose's own sole legitimacy after decades sharing formal power with his stepmother. It may well have been some combination of both. Following Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III assumed sole rule. Across a reign of several decades, he proved himself one of the most militarily successful rulers in Egyptian history. He led numerous campaigns into the Levant, establishing Egyptian influence over a network of city-states and vassal territories stretching north into what is now Syria. His most celebrated victory came at the Battle of Megiddo around 1457 BCE against a coalition of Canaanite rulers who had rebelled against Egyptian influence. Unusually detailed contemporary military records describe Thutmose's decision to lead his army through a narrow mountain pass. His own officers considered the route dangerously exposed, preferring a safer but longer alternative. The gamble paid off. It achieved complete tactical surprise against the assembled coalition forces, resulting in a decisive Egyptian victory and, after a lengthy siege, the city's surrender. Campaigns of this kind, repeated across Thutmose's reign, established a pattern of Egyptian imperial administration in the Levant. Rather than relying on direct occupation, Egypt built a network of local vassal rulers bound by oath, who sent their own children to be raised at the Egyptian court. This system secured loyalty while also giving Egypt a steady supply of foreign-born administrators already educated in Egyptian language and custom. Thutmose III's military career extended across roughly 17 separate campaigns over the following 2 decades. Modern historians have compared his record to that of later conquering generals from other historical traditions. His campaigns pushed Egyptian influence as far north as the Euphrates River, where Thutmose ordered a commemorative inscription carved into the landscape, marking the furthest extent of Egyptian military reach. The gesture deliberately echoed a similar boundary marker. His great-grandfather Thutmose I had reportedly set up generations earlier, during an equally ambitious though less thoroughly documented campaign into the same region. What makes this record unusually well understood compared to the fragmentary evidence surviving from many other periods of Egyptian warfare is the survival of detailed campaign annals. These were inscribed on the walls of Karnak Temple by his official scribe and military companion Thanani, recording the army's daily marches and the tribute and plunder collected from conquered cities. They even include, in the account of the Megiddo campaign, direct quotations attributed to Thutmose's council of war, debating which route to take before the decisive attack. This level of narrative military detail has no real parallel anywhere else in the surviving Egyptian record, and it has made this single campaign one of the most closely analyzed battles of the entire ancient world. Nubia's gold deserves particular emphasis in any account of New Kingdom prosperity. Egyptian control over the mining regions of the Eastern Desert and Nubia gave the crown access to a resource whose abundance, by the standards of the wider Bronze Age Near East, drew genuine envy from abroad. Foreign rulers corresponding with the Egyptian court sometimes requested gold from their Egyptian counterparts in letters that survive among the Amarna Royal Archive. Their wording suggests real awareness of just how much of the metal Egypt seemed able to command. One Babylonian king reportedly complained that gold was, in Egypt, as plentiful as dust upon the ground. This mineral wealth was extracted through a demanding and dangerous mining process, relying on convict and conscript labor working under brutal desert conditions. As later Greek and Roman accounts of similar Ptolemaic-era operations in the same region make clear. It funded temple construction and also an elaborate system of royal gift exchange and marriage diplomacy. Through this system, New Kingdom Egypt maintained relationships with the other great powers of the Bronze Age, Near East, including Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. Ruling families across this network exchanged daughters in diplomatic marriage with the Egyptian court, along with lavish gifts of gold, horses, and manufactured luxury goods. Historians sometimes call this system the Amarna Age's Club of Great Powers. Egypt stood as one of a small number of clearly dominant states within it, its rulers treating other kings as roughly equal partners, even while presenting their own subjects with a very different, unmatched image of royal favor. The wealth generated by this new imperial system flowed into Egypt through tribute, trade, and the gold mines of Nubia, which by this period had come under far tighter Egyptian administrative control than during the Middle Kingdom. It funded an immense period of temple construction, most visibly at the sprawling temple complex of Karnak near Thebes. Successive New Kingdom pharaohs expanded Karnak generation after generation into one of the largest religious complexes ever built anywhere in the ancient world, its innermost sanctuaries dedicated to the god Amun. His priesthood grew correspondingly into one of the wealthiest and most politically significant institutions in Egyptian society, a development that would eventually have serious political consequences for the New Kingdom's later history. It was against this backdrop of established religious and political order that one of the most unusual episodes in Egyptian history unfolded under a pharaoh who came to the throne around 1353 BCE as Amenhotep IV. Early in his reign, this king began promoting the worship of a single aspect of the sun, the Aten, above virtually all other traditional Egyptian gods. The Aten was represented not as a traditional anthropomorphic deity, but as a solar disk whose rays terminated in small hands. By his 5th regnal year, he had changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning something like effective spirit of the Aten. He relocated the capital away from Thebes entirely, to a newly built city on a previously unoccupied site he named Akhenaten. He also took increasingly aggressive steps against the traditional cults, most of all that of Amun, closing temples and, in some cases, having the names of other gods physically chiseled out of existing monuments. Historians continue to debate the precise nature of this religious transformation. Some see something approaching true monotheism. Others see a more limited elevation of one god to unprecedented preeminence. while other deities continued to exist in a diminished capacity. What is clearer is the disruption it caused to Egypt's traditional religious and administrative establishment, and the speed with which it was reversed after Akhenaten's death. The traditional priesthoods and gods were restored. The capital returned to its previous location, and Akhenaten's own memory was, in later official king lists, largely erased, his monuments dismantled and reused as building material for other structures. Akhenaten's religious reform was accompanied by an equally distinctive artistic movement. It departed sharply from the formal, idealized conventions that had governed Egyptian art for the preceding 16 centuries. Early excavators, encountering Amarna, period sculpture and relief for the first time, sometimes struggled to reconcile it with anything they had previously catalogued as Egyptian. Royal figures from this period were rendered with elongated skulls, narrow, almost gaunt faces, pronounced hips, and softly rounded bellies. This style was applied not only to Akhenaten himself, but to his queen, Nefertiti, and their daughters. With no real precedent in the more formally distant royal imagery of earlier reigns, Nefertiti herself emerges from the surviving art and inscriptions of this period as a figure of unusual prominence for a queen. She is depicted in some reliefs performing rituals and smiting enemies, in poses conventionally reserved for the king alone. This level of visibility has led some historians to speculate she may have exercised independent religious and political authority, or even briefly ruled in her own right under a separate royal name following Akhenaten's death. The surviving evidence remains fragmentary enough that this question, like so much else about the Amarna interlude, continues to generate active scholarly disagreement rather than settled consensus. The famous painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, recovered from the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna in 1912 and now housed in Berlin, has become, alongside the golden mask of Tutankhamun, one of the two most widely recognized single objects to survive from the whole of ancient Egyptian civilization. Its serene, symmetrical beauty offers a striking counterpoint to the deliberately unconventional royal imagery that otherwise defines the art of this brief and unusual period. The Amarna period, whatever its ultimate religious significance, also left modern historians one of the richest surviving archives of ancient diplomatic correspondence anywhere in the Bronze Age. Near East. It is a collection of several hundred clay tablets written in the Akkadian cuneiform script that served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the period. They were discovered at the abandoned site of Akhenaten's capital and are known today as the Amarna letters. These tablets preserve genuine, unfiltered correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of other major Bronze Age powers, including Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. They address royal marriage alliances, exchanges of lavish diplomatic gifts, and the sometimes prickly negotiations over protocol between rulers who each considered themselves the equal of any other. Alongside this sits a further substantial body of correspondence from Egypt's Levantine vassal rulers. Their letters often plead for military assistance against local rivals or against the encroachment of a group of raiders and dissidents referred to as the Habiru. They offer an unusually vivid, unvarnished picture of the practical strains and local politics involved in maintaining Egypt's new kingdom empire on the ground, far removed from the idealized imagery of effortless royal triumph found on temple walls. The reversal of Akhenaten's religious revolution took place during the brief reign of a young successor, quite possibly Akhenaten's own son. He came to the throne around the age of 9 under the name Tutankhamun, a name reflecting his father's religious innovations, before changing it to Tutankhamun, reflecting the restoration of Amun's traditional preeminence. Tutankhamun himself died young, probably in his late teens, after a reign of only about a decade. By the standards of Egyptian royal history, he would likely have remained a minor and largely forgotten figure, one king among many recorded briefly in later king lists. What changed that was his tomb. Small and modest by royal standards, precisely because of his early and probably unexpected death, it happened to escape the systematic robbery that befell almost every other pyramid and royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It was preserved instead, largely by chance, beneath debris from later construction work in the valley. Its rediscovery in the 20th century revealed, for the first time in the modern era, something close to the complete original burial equipment of an Egyptian king. It offers an unparalleled window into the material culture of New Kingdom royalty that no other surviving tomb has matched. The circumstances of that rediscovery in November of 1922 mark something of a turning point in how the wider world came to understand ancient Egypt. The British archaeologist Howard Carter had spent years searching the Valley of the Kings under the sponsorship of Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy English patron. Carnarvon's willingness to fund an increasingly costly and, for a long stretch, entirely unsuccessful excavation was, by Carter's own later account, wearing thin by the 1922 season. He was apparently prepared to withdraw his support had that year's dig failed to produce results. On the 4th of November, a young water boy working on the excavation team stumbled upon a step cut into the bedrock, the first of a flight of stairs leading down to a sealed doorway. Carter summoned Carnarvon from England to be present for the opening. He then famously peered through a small breach in a blocked doorway by candlelight. Asked by his anxious patron whether he could see anything, Carter is recorded as having replied simply that he could see wonderful things. The painstaking work of clearing, documenting, and conserving the tomb's contents took the better part of a decade, involving specialists in conservation, photography, and chemistry brought to Egypt specifically for the task. The discovery also generated an enormous scale of press coverage, at a moment when radio and international newspaper syndication were making global news distribution faster than ever before. This helped launch a wave of popular fascination with ancient Egypt, sometimes called Egyptomania. It shaped everything from architectural and fashion trends in the 1920s to the way museums around the world would go on to display their Egyptian collections for the rest of the 20th century. Following the Amarna interlude and the brief reigns of Tutankhamun and his immediate successors, stability was more firmly restored under a new line of rulers beginning with Ramesses I, whose short reign around 1292 BCE established the 19th dynasty. His son and successor, Seti I, undertook a vigorous campaign of military reassertion in the Levant, recovering territory Egyptian control had lost during the internal disruptions of the Amarna period. He also sponsored an ambitious building program, including the beautifully preserved temple at Abydos, a site of particular religious significance as a traditional cult center associated with Osiris. It holds some of the finest and best preserved relief carving to survive from the entire New Kingdom, its painted colors remaining strikingly vivid even after more than 3,000 years. The New Kingdom's imperial ambitions reached a further, more contested high point under Ramses II, Seti's son. He came to the throne around 11279 BCE and reigned for an extraordinarily long 66 years. During that time, he pursued an active military and building policy. It left more surviving monuments bearing his name than any other Egyptian pharaoh. That reflects both real achievement and an especially vigorous program of self-commemoration, including the not infrequent practice of having his own name carved over the monuments of earlier kings. His most famous military engagement, the Battle of Kadesh, was fought around 1074 BCE against the Hittite Empire, a major rival power based in Anatolia, for control of contested territory in Syria. The battle nearly ended in catastrophe when Ramses's forces were caught in a Hittite ambush. Egyptian accounts, unsurprisingly given their purpose as royal propaganda, present the battle as a personal triumph secured through Ramesses' own courage in rallying his scattered troops. Surviving Hittite records suggest a far less decisive outcome. What can be said with more confidence is that the battle led, roughly 15 years later, to a formal peace treaty between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. It survives in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, and is generally regarded as the earliest surviving peace treaty in recorded history, whose text survives in reasonably complete form from both signatory parties. It established mutual recognition of borders, a promise of non-aggression, and provisions for mutual defense and the extradition of political refugees, a level of diplomatic sophistication that surprises many people encountering it for the first time. Beyond this diplomatic achievement, Ramses II's long reign left an equally striking architectural footprint across Egypt and Nubia. It reflects both his genuine building ambitions and his determination that posterity should be left in no doubt of his accomplishments. His mortuary temple at Thebes, known today as the Ramesseum, incorporated a colossal seated statue of the king carved from a single block of granite, weighing well over 1,000 tons. Later travelers, including the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, recorded this stoneworking ambition with evident astonishment, even in its already damaged state. Further south, at Abu Simbel near Egypt's border with Nubia, Ramses ordered the construction of 2 temples carved directly into the sandstone cliffside, rather than built as freestanding structures. The larger is fronted by 4 seated colossi of the king himself, each over 60 feet tall. They were positioned with such careful astronomical calculation that, on 2 specific days each year, the rising sun's light penetrates the temple's full 60-meter depth to illuminate statues of the gods and of Ramesses himself, seated in the innermost sanctuary. That alignment's precision remains a genuine point of engineering interest even today. These Nubian temples served a clear political as well as religious purpose. They projected Egyptian royal and divine authority into a frontier region whose loyalty and resource wealth, not least its gold, mattered to the Egyptian crown throughout the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom's long imperial prosperity began to erode in the centuries following Ramses II's death, under pressure from internal and external stresses, whose relative importance historians continue to debate. Beginning in the late 13th and continuing into the 12th century BCE, Egyptian records describe repeated incursions by groups referred to collectively as the Sea Peoples. This loose, still not fully understood confederation of seaborne raiders and migrants was likely displaced by wider political and environmental upheaval across the Aegean and Anatolian world. Their attacks contributed to the collapse of several major Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, including the Hittite Empire itself. Its sudden and still somewhat mysterious disappearance from the historical record removed the major power that had balanced Egyptian influence in the Levant for well over a century. Egypt, under Ramses III around 1175 BCE, managed to repel a major assault by these groups. A combined land and naval battle is commemorated in detailed relief carvings at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. They depict Egyptian archers raining arrows down upon Sea People's ships, trapped and overturned in the Nile's delta channels. One of the very few detailed naval battle scenes to survive from the entire ancient Near East. The effort required to repel this threat, however, came at a cost. Mounting internal economic strain followed, including well-documented instances of delayed wages, triggering what may be the earliest recorded labor strike in history. Specialized workers building and decorating royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings walked off the job and staged a sit-in protest at a nearby mortuary temple when promised grain rations failed to arrive on schedule. Their surviving daily work journals record the episode in detail. A documented conspiracy against Ramses III's own life, originating within his royal household, added to the strain. Together, these pressures left Egypt seriously weakened, even in apparent victory. Over the following century, central royal authority gradually eroded further. The empire's Levantine territories were lost. By around 1277 BCE, Egypt had once again fragmented into a period of divided rule. A line of high priests of Amun now exercised substantial independent authority from Thebes, alongside a nominally separate royal line ruling from the north. This marks the conventional end of the New Kingdom and the beginning of what historians call the Third Intermediate Period. The very wealth that had made royal burial in the Valley of the Kings so elaborate had also made it an irresistible target. The practical failure of successive Egyptian governments to protect these tombs from robbery forms its own quiet, largely unofficial coda to the New Kingdom's story of decline. Surviving trial records from the reign of Ramses IX document formal investigations into tomb robbery accusations, including testimony extracted under interrogation from workers and officials implicated in stripping royal burials of their gold and precious materials. This was not the work of occasional opportunists. It was the work of organized networks, operating with the apparent knowledge and, in some documented cases, the direct involvement of the very officials charged with guarding the necropolis. Faced with this ongoing crisis, priests during the 21st dynasty undertook a striking, if practically resigned, program of damage control. They gathered the disturbed and often already partially stripped mummies of numerous New Kingdom pharaohs, including several of the New Kingdom's most famous rulers, from their original individual tombs. They reburied them together in two hidden communal caches, one at Deir el-Bahari and another in the tomb of Amenhotep II. There they lay concealed and largely forgotten until their rediscovery in 1881 and 1898 respectively. Those discoveries delivered into modern hands, in a single stroke, the physical remains of a substantial portion of the New Kingdom's most significant rulers. Their preservation came not through the success of their original elaborate burial arrangements. It came through this later, more modest act of priestly foresight, once it had become clear that no tomb, however well hidden or heavily sealed, could be relied upon to remain undisturbed indefinitely. The vast majority of Egyptians experienced their civilization not through royal battles or temple construction, but through the steady, largely unrecorded rhythm of agricultural life along the riverbank. It is worth turning to that daily existence now, before following Egypt's story further through the centuries of foreign rule that lay ahead. The overwhelming majority of the Egyptian population lived as farmers. Their year was organized entirely around the Nile's flood cycle. During the flood season, when fields lay submerged and agricultural work was impossible, this same rural labor force became available for state projects, temple construction, canal maintenance, and the great pyramid building efforts of the Old Kingdom. This meant Egypt's monumental architecture and its agricultural economy were never really in competition for the same labor. The flood season made one impossible precisely when it made the other available. Once the floodwaters receded, typically in early autumn, farmers moved quickly to plant their crops in the newly deposited silt. Some used simple wooden plows drawn by oxen. Others worked entirely by hand in smaller plots. They planted emmer wheat and barley as the primary staple grains, alongside flax for linen production, and a wide range of vegetables including onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, and legumes. These garden plots were often irrigated by hand, using a simple counterweighted lifting device called a shaduf. It let a single worker raise water from a canal or the river itself into high irrigation channels with far less effort than carrying water by hand. Cattle, sheep, and goats provided meat, though for most ordinary Egyptians, meat appears to have been occasional rather than daily food. The everyday diet centered instead on bread, made from the wheat that dominated Egyptian agriculture, and beer. This thick, nutritious, only mildly alcoholic beverage served as a dietary staple across all levels of society, consumed by laborers and officials alike. Surviving ration records even show it distributed as part of standard payment to workers on state projects. The state's need for an accurate advance sense of each year's flood led to the development of a specialized measuring device called a nilometer. It was essentially a step-stone shaft or stairway, built directly into the riverbank or into a temple precinct along the Nile, marked with graduated measurements that let officials record the water's rising height each year with reasonable precision. Such structures survive at several key points along the river, including one exceptionally well-preserved example on the island of Elephantine near Aswan, close to the river's traditional entry point into Egypt. These readings mattered enormously to the practical business of governing. The height of the flood translated directly into an estimate of the coming harvest, and that estimate determined the rate of taxation officials would apply to farmers that year. Surviving administrative papyri describe scribes touring the fields after the water receded to assess and register the boundaries and productive potential of each plot before the harvest was gathered. A flood that rose too little threatened famine, since insufficient water meant less new farmland brought under cultivation and less soil renewal for existing fields. A flood that rose too high risked washing away boundary markers, damaging settlements built too close to the floodplain, and delaying planting later into the growing season than was ideal. Egyptian administrators approached the flood then not simply as a blessing to be celebrated, but as a variable requiring careful, ongoing measurement. Surviving hymns to the god Hapi, the personification of the Nile's inundation, reflect this concern. They characteristically pray not simply for a flood, but specifically for one of moderate, well-balanced height. Egyptian homes for ordinary families were typically built from mud brick, a readily available and inexpensive material well suited to Egypt's dry climate. Thick walls provided welcome insulation against the heat. Small windows, placed high, limited direct sun exposure while allowing air circulation. Many homes had a flat roof used for additional living, storage, and sleeping space, especially during the hottest months. Furniture in an ordinary household was generally simple and functional: low stools, woven mats, and storage chests, in contrast to the elaborately carved and gilded furniture recovered from royal and elite burials. Even modest households appear to have placed considerable value on small household shrines dedicated to protective deities. Most common was Bes, a dwarf god associated with protection of the home and, especially, of women in childbirth, and Tawer, a goddess depicted with the body of a hippopotamus, also closely tied to protection during pregnancy and childbirth. These shrines reflect the very real dangers of childbirth in the ancient world, and the domestic religious practices that developed in response to them. Family structure in ancient Egypt appears, based on surviving legal and administrative documents, to have granted women a markedly higher degree of legal independence than was typical in many other ancient societies. Women could own and inherit property, initiate divorce, conduct business transactions, and represent themselves in legal proceedings without a male guardian. Even so, the highest offices of state administration and priesthood remained, in practice, overwhelmingly dominated by men. Women ruling as pharaoh in their own right, such as Hatshepsut, remained rare exceptions rather than an established pattern. Children in ordinary families were expected to begin contributing to household and agricultural labor from a fairly young age. Surviving evidence, including toys, games, and depictions of children playing, suggests that Egyptian family life still allowed for genuine childhood recreation alongside these responsibilities. Formal education, including instruction in the demanding hieroglyphic and hieratic writing systems, remained largely restricted to boys destined for careers as scribes, priests, or officials. This was one of the more realistic routes towards social advancement available in Egyptian society, since a successful scribal career could carry a family from relatively modest origins into positions of real administrative influence over a generation or two. Marriage itself, based on surviving contracts and legal records, functioned essentially as a private arrangement between two families, rather than as a formal state or religious ceremony requiring official sanction. This is reflected in the absence of any surviving wedding ritual comparable to those documented for later Mediterranean cultures. A couple was generally considered married simply once the woman had moved into the man's household, an event sometimes marked by a family celebration but apparently not by any binding religious rite administered by a priest. Marriage contracts, where they survive, focus overwhelmingly on practical financial matters. Most important was the wife's right to retain and eventually reclaim property she had brought into the marriage in the event of divorce or her husband's death. Many surviving examples also specify an allowance. These arrangements reflect the real legal protections Egyptian women held over their own property, even within marriage. Divorce itself was available to both husbands and wives, though apparently exercised more easily by men in practice. It required no elaborate legal proceeding, only a public declaration and the settling of financial obligations already spelled out in the marriage contract. This straightforward process underscores the practical, contract-based character of Egyptian marriage, an institution primarily concerned with property and household arrangement rather than religious sacrament. Above the ordinary households and craft workshops that made up the bulk of Egyptian society stood a state bureaucracy. Its upper ranks, while dominated by men from established administrative families, remained at least formally open to talented individuals who rose through scribal training and demonstrated competence. At the summit of this civil administration, immediately below the king himself, stood the vizier. A surviving New Kingdom text known as the Duties of the Vizier describes this office in unusual detail. Its responsibilities were sweeping. The vizier oversaw the treasury and the granaries the entire redistributive economy depended on, and served as the highest court of appeal in legal disputes. He managed the vast labor requirements of state construction projects and received daily reports from regional officials before briefing the king each morning on the state of the nation. They warn against favoritism toward the wealthy and connected at the expense of the poor, and insist that the vizier hear every petitioner's case in full, regardless of how minor it might appear. Whether or not this standard was consistently honored across 3,000 years of Egyptian administration, it shows that fairness and accessible justice were explicitly articulated as core administrative values within the pharaonic state. Work and craft specialization extended across a wide range of trades beyond agriculture. Potters produced the enormous quantities of ceramic vessels needed for storing grain, beer, wine, and oil across Egyptian society. Weavers, predominantly women, transformed flax into the linen that formed the near-universal basis of Egyptian clothing. Nearly all Egyptians wore linen regardless of social status, though the quality, fineness, and quantity a person owned varied enormously according to wealth. Metalworkers worked initially in copper and bronze, and much later in Egyptian history in iron. Specialized craftsmen handled the construction and decoration of tombs and temples, including skilled artists and sculptors. Their work was rarely signed or individually credited in the way later artistic traditions would come to expect. Yet it achieved a level of technical sophistication and stylistic consistency that modern art historians continue to study and admire. Ancient Egypt functioned for nearly its entire pharaonic history without a true minted coinage, a fact that surprises many people familiar with the coined money systems of contemporary Mesopotamia and, later, the Greek world. Instead, Egyptian exchange operated in large part through a redistributive system centered on state and temple granaries. These granaries collected agricultural surplus as a form of taxation and reissued it as payment for labor and services. Alongside this ran a genuine, if less formally documented, tradition of direct barter exchange in local markets. There, value was commonly reckoned using a standardized unit called the deben, a fixed weight of copper, or for larger transactions, silver or gold. Against this unit, the relative value of goods, a jar of oil against the length of linen, a goat against the quantity of grain, could be calculated and agreed upon without any physical currency changing hands. The deben functioned essentially as an abstract unit of account rather than a physical coin. Markets themselves, based on textual and artistic evidence, appear to have been lively, informal affairs. They were held in open spaces within towns and along riverbanks, where boats could easily dock to unload goods. Individual sellers, often women according to surviving depictions, set out produce, bread, fish, and craft goods for direct exchange. It was a picture of everyday commercial life, quite a bit more informal and small-scale than the grand state-directed construction projects and temple economies that dominate the better-preserved monumental record. Egyptian religious life extended well beyond the grand state temples dedicated to major gods like Amun, Ra, and Osiris. It reached into a rich landscape of personal and household devotion. Popular festivals were part of this. During them, the normally hidden cult statue of a temple's principal deity would be carried in procession through the streets in a portable shrine. This gave ordinary Egyptians, otherwise excluded from the temple's innermost sanctuaries, an opportunity for direct religious participation. Surviving records even describe the chance to pose questions to the god through a form of ritual consultation conducted during these public processions. The grandest of these annual festivals was the Opet Festival, celebrated each year at Thebes during the New Kingdom. It offers a useful illustration of how thoroughly religious ritual could dominate the civic calendar. Over a period lasting, in some years, more than 3 weeks, the sacred image of Amun was carried from its home at Karnak Temple to the nearby temple of Luxor, a journey of only a few miles. Priests carried the god's portable shrine on their shoulders and, for the return journey, sailed the divine images along the Nile aboard an elaborately decorated ceremonial barge towed by a fleet of smaller boats. Crowds of ordinary Theban residents lined the route. The processional avenue connecting the two temples, later formalized under later rulers as a monumental sphinx-lined causeway filled with spectators, musicians, and dancers. The festival's stated religious purpose involved a ritual renewal of the reigning king's divine authority through a mystical union with Amun believed to take place within the inner sanctuary at Luxor Temple. But its practical social function extended well beyond this theological core. It provided an occasion for public feasting, funded by temple resources. Ordinary Egyptians could approach unusually close to sacred images normally hidden from view. And the reigning pharaoh, whether present in person or represented by his statue and officiating priests, could reaffirm his bond with both the city of Thebes and the god whose favor his own legitimacy so heavily depended upon. Belief in an afterlife permeated Egyptian culture at every social level. The elaborate mummification and tomb equipment associated with royal and elite burial existed on a sliding scale of cost and complexity. Wealthier Egyptians could afford increasingly elaborate versions of the same basic practices that poorer Egyptians approximated through simpler burial goods and more modest preservation techniques. The underlying belief system about the soul's journey after death was shared, even as the material resources devoted to that journey varied enormously by social class. The full process of mummification for a wealthy individual, as reconstructed by modern researchers through ancient textual descriptions and direct examination of preserved remains, began with the removal of internal organs. These were themselves separately preserved and, in later periods, placed in canopic jars associated with 4 protective deities. The body was then dried using a natural salt compound called natron over a period of roughly 40 days, and afterward wrapped in many layers of linen, often interspersed with protective amulets. The completed mummy was placed within 1 or more nested coffins, and, for those who could afford it, a stone sarcophagus. All of this served to preserve the body as a physical anchor for the spirit's continued existence in the afterlife. The beliefs that gave the mummification process its meaning were part of a larger, undeniably intricate body of funerary literature. It developed across the whole span of pharaonic history, from the pyramid texts inscribed within Old Kingdom royal burial chambers, through the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom. The coffin texts extended similar funerary spells to a somewhat broader, though still elite, segment of society. It culminated in the New Kingdom's Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, prayers, and instructional texts, copied onto papyrus scrolls and often lavishly illustrated. The deceased was believed to need these to navigate the dangers of the underworld toward a final judgment. This judgment, depicted repeatedly in surviving funerary art, involved the weighing of the deceased's heart. The Egyptians understood the heart as the seat of a person's conscience, memory, and moral character. It was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the same concept of truth and cosmic order. The living pharaoh was charged with upholding, in the presence of Osiris and a tribunal of divine judges. A heart found lighter than or equal in weight to the feather indicated a life lived in accordance with proper conduct. It granted the deceased passage into a blessed afterlife, often imagined as an idealized, eternally fertile version of the Egyptian countryside itself, called the Field of Reeds. A heart weighed down by wrongdoing, by contrast, was believed to be devoured by a composite monster called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. The result was a form of final, permanent non-existence, an outcome. Egyptian belief seems to have regarded as deeply unsettling, far more troubling to the religious imagination than any concept of active punishment. This entire body of belief was refined and copied across well over 1,000 years of continuous use. It reveals a civilization for whom the boundary between religious literature moral instruction and practical preparation for death was never sharply drawn. Beyond agriculture and craft production, ancient Egypt developed a body of practical and technical knowledge. It was not organized into anything resembling a modern scientific discipline, but it reflected genuine accumulated expertise, built up over centuries of observation and record-keeping. Egyptian medicine, as reconstructed from surviving papyrus documents such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, offers one example. The text focuses chiefly on the treatment of traumatic injuries, structured with a strikingly clinical, almost case study approach, describing examination, diagnosis, and treatment for a sequence of specific wounds. It reveals a tradition that combined demonstrably effective practical techniques, including wound closure, splinting of fractures, and a range of surgical procedures, with remedies rooted in magical and religious belief. Egyptian physicians generally did not draw the sharp distinction between physical and supernatural causes of illness that later medical traditions would insist upon. Egyptian mathematics, similarly documented in texts such as the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, shows a practical, problem-solving approach well suited to the demands of administration. It handled the calculation of land area for taxation purposes after the annual flood, when field boundaries were frequently washed away and had to be resurveyed. It also handled the computation of grain storage volumes and the structural calculations necessary for monumental construction. This was achieved through a system of unit fractions and a base. 10 numbering system that, while different in its underlying logic from later positional number systems, proved entirely adequate to the engineering and administrative challenges Egyptian society regularly confronted. Transportation and trade across Egypt depended overwhelmingly on the Nile itself. For most of pharaonic history, it functioned as the primary highway along which people, goods, and administrative communication moved between one end of the country and the other. A convenient natural pattern reinforced this role. The river's current flowed north, while the prevailing wind blew from the north, letting boats travel downstream simply by drifting with the current, and upstream by raising a sail to catch the wind. This convenience shaped Egyptian transportation and indeed Egyptian language itself, since the hieroglyphic sign for travel south incorporated a sailing boat, while the sign for travel north incorporated a boat without one. Egyptian boat builders worked with a domestic timber supply limited mostly to relatively short and knotty native trees, ill-suited to shipbuilding. They developed distinctive construction techniques instead, using shorter planks bound and pegged together rather than the long structural keels favored by later Mediterranean shipbuilding traditions. Some earlier scholars doubted the seaworthiness of this method. That doubt was answered convincingly when a full-scale reconstruction of one of the funerary boats buried beside the Great Pyramid was assembled from its original disassembled timbers and found to be a fully capable vessel. Military life for the ordinary Egyptian soldier grew more organized and specialized during the New Kingdom's era of active imperial campaigning, developing well beyond the more ad hoc levies of earlier periods. The New Kingdom army was organized into large divisions, each numbering several thousand men and named after a major deity, such as the divisions of Amun, Ra, Pietà, and Set that appear in the detailed Egyptian accounts of the Battle of Kadesh. Each division was further divided into companies of around 200 men, commanded by officers who had typically risen through a genuine, if informal, career structure within the military rather than through hereditary position alone. This offered one of the more realistic paths of social advancement available to ordinary Egyptian men alongside the scribal profession. Chariot warfare, introduced through Egypt's earlier contact with the Hyksos, had by this period developed into a specialized and prestigious branch of the military. Chariot crews typically consisted of a driver and an archer working in close coordination. The chariots themselves were light, fast, wooden-framed vehicles built for speed and maneuverability rather than sheer weight. They became closely associated with the elite, and especially in royal battle imagery with the pharaoh's own personal role in combat. Temple relief carvings depict him repeatedly charging alone into masses of enemy soldiers. Egyptologists understand this as a stylized convention of royal triumph, ideological rather than a literal record of events. Even when, as in the case of Kadesh, a real engagement clearly lies behind the depiction. The third intermediate period, following the New Kingdom's collapse around 177 BCE, saw Egypt's political unity fracture in ways that proved over the following centuries far more persistent than earlier periods of fragmentation. Egypt experienced rule by a Libyan dynasty, descended from populations that had settled in the Western Delta over preceding generations. This was followed by a period of rule from Nubia. Kings from the Kingdom of Kush, itself deeply shaped by centuries of earlier Egyptian cultural and religious contact, conquered and ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, beginning around 744 BCE. They presented themselves explicitly as restorers of traditional Egyptian religious and cultural practice, even while governing from a position rooted in what had once been a subordinate southern territory. It was an arrangement that speaks to the durability and prestige of Egyptian religious and cultural forms, even at a moment of genuine political weakness. This Nubian dynasty was eventually driven out by the more immediately pressing threat of Assyrian invasion. The Assyrian Empire, the dominant military power of the Near East during this period, invaded Egypt in the 670s and 660s BCE under its kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. They defeated the reigning Nubian pharaoh Taharqa, and after further resistance under his successor Tutankhamun, sacked the ancient religious capital of Thebes in 663 BCE. The destruction was so severe that later biblical and Greek sources continue to reference it as a byword for catastrophic ruin centuries afterward. The prophet Nahum, writing in the following century, invoked the memory of Thebes' fall as a warning of what awaited Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, in turn. The Assyrians did not attempt to incorporate Egypt into direct long-term administrative control in the manner of later conquerors. Instead, they installed a local ruler from the delta city of Sais as a tribute-paying vassal. That decision inadvertently laid the groundwork for the fully independent Said dynasty that would emerge only a few years later, once Assyrian attention turned to more pressing crises elsewhere in its own overextended empire. Egyptian independence was restored shortly afterward under this 26th dynasty, ruling from Sais. This period is sometimes called the Said Renaissance for its deliberate revival of Old and Middle Kingdom artistic and religious forms. It was paired with a shrewdly pragmatic foreign policy, one that made extensive use of Greek mercenary soldiers and built increasingly close commercial ties with the Greek world. These developments laid the groundwork for the deeper Hellenistic integration Egypt would experience in the centuries that followed. Egyptian independence proved short-lived against the rising power of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Persia conquered Egypt in 525 BCE under its king Cambyses, incorporating it as a wealthy and administratively significant province, generally referred to in Persian sources as a satrapy, within the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet produced. Persian administration was resented by segments of the traditional Egyptian priestly and military elite, who had lost the independent authority they enjoyed under native rule. Yet it was not uniformly harsh. Several Persian kings, chiefly Darius I, invested in Egyptian temple building and infrastructure. This included completing a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, a precursor in concept, if not in exact route, to the much later Suez Canal. Persian rule, nonetheless, proved intermittent and frequently contested, with periods of successful Egyptian rebellion and restored native rule, including a fully independent 28th through 30th dynasties spanning roughly 404 to 343 BCE, alternating with renewed Persian reconquest. Egypt was conquered once more, this time by the Macedonian king Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. Egyptian sources tended to describe this not as a foreign conquest in the manner of the Assyrian or Persian invasions, but in terms drawing on much older Egyptian traditions of liberation from disliked foreign rule. Alexander was welcomed, at least by the Egyptian priestly establishment whose records survive, as a deliverer from unpopular Persian administration rather than resented as a new conqueror. Alexander's death in 323 BCE, without a clear adult heir, led to the division of his enormous, hastily assembled empire among his surviving generals. Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy, who established a new ruling dynasty that would govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, the longest continuous period of stable, centralized rule in Egyptian history following the end of the New Kingdom. The Ptolemaic dynasty was of Macedonian Greek origin and kept Greek as the primary language of administration and elite culture. Even so, it invested heavily and deliberately in traditional Egyptian religious institutions and royal imagery. Ptolemaic rulers adopted pharaonic titles and funded temple construction on a scale reminiscent of the New Kingdom's great building projects. They presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects through the same visual and ritual vocabulary of divine kingship that had defined Egyptian rulership for nearly 3,000 years. All this happened even while they governed an economy and administrative system that, in its everyday operation, drew heavily on Greek commercial and bureaucratic practice. The dynasty's capital, Alexandria, was founded by Alexander himself at the western edge of the Nile Delta. Over the following generations, it grew into one of the great intellectual and commercial centers of the ancient Mediterranean world, home to a famous library and research institution that attracted scholars from across the Greek-speaking world. The precise details and eventual fate of its physical collection remain subjects of ongoing historical debate. But the library came to symbolize an era of real, cross-cultural intellectual exchange between Egyptian, Greek, and other Mediterranean traditions. This cross-cultural character extended into the everyday administration of the country as well. Ptolemaic Egypt developed what was, in effect, a dual administrative system. Greek-speaking officials and settlers concentrated mostly in Alexandria and a handful of other Greek-founded cities, operating under Greek law and Greek civic institutions. The rural Egyptian population, still the overwhelming majority of the country's inhabitants, continued to live under a largely unaltered framework of traditional Egyptian law, custom, and temple-centered religious life. The two systems interacted most directly through the tax and administrative apparatus. Ptolemaic officials adapted this apparatus from earlier Egyptian precedent to extract the country's substantial agricultural surplus, above all its grain, for both domestic use and lucrative export across the wider Mediterranean world. A useful illustration of this bicultural governance survives in the Rosetta Stone itself, carved in 106 BCE during the reign of Ptolemy V. It records a decree issued by a council of Egyptian priests in 3 parallel scripts: hieroglyphic, the everyday Egyptian demotic script, and Greek. This was a practical measure meant to ensure the decree was accessible to both the traditional priestly establishment and the Greek-speaking administrative class. French soldiers discovered the stone in 1799. It was eventually deciphered in the 1820s, largely through the work of the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. The stone would prove the essential key that finally allowed modern scholars to read the hieroglyphic script again, after well over 1,000 years, during which its meaning had been entirely lost. The Ptolemaic dynasty's long rule ended with its final and most famous ruler, Cleopatra VII. She came to the throne in 51 BCE at just 18 years of age, initially ruling jointly with her younger brother in accordance with Ptolemaic dynastic custom. By this point, Egypt's continued independence had become increasingly dependent on navigating the escalating political rivalries of the Roman Republic, then in the final turbulent decades before its own transformation into an empire. Cleopatra is recorded by ancient sources as the first member of her dynasty in nearly 3 centuries of Greek-speaking Ptolemaic rule to have learned the Egyptian language. She was reportedly fluent in several other languages spoken across her diverse kingdom as well. This detail speaks to a real political shrewdness. She governed a population whose loyalty and whose vital agricultural productivity still depended heavily on the kind of traditional religious and cultural legitimacy her predecessors had cultivated through temple patronage and pharaonic imagery. Her political alliances reflected the same shrewdness. She allied first with Julius Caesar, whom she met after fleeing Alexandria during a civil conflict with her brother, and to whom she bore a son. She later allied with Mark Antony, with whom she had 3 further children, forming a political and personal partnership that combined Egyptian resources with Antony's Roman military authority in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a carefully calculated attempt to preserve Egyptian independence, by aligning with whichever Roman faction seemed best positioned to guarantee it. This strategy ultimately failed when Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. The following year brought both of their deaths. According to the most widely repeated ancient account, Cleopatra died by way of a poisonous snakebite, though the precise circumstances remain a matter of some historical uncertainty. Egypt was then formally annexed as a Roman province, brought under the direct personal control of the emperor rather than the ordinary provincial administration used elsewhere in the Roman world. This reflects just how valuable Rome's new emperors considered Egypt's enormous grain-producing capacity for feeding the city of Rome itself. Roman rule brought Egypt formally within the same imperial administrative system governing events elsewhere across the Roman world. Traditional Egyptian temple culture and religious practice were not immediately suppressed, but gradually declined over the following centuries, under the combined pressures of reduced royal patronage, changing administrative priorities, and, eventually, the spread of Christianity across the Roman world. The last securely dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae in 394 CE. It marks something close to the final living use of a writing system that had, by that point, already been in continuous use for well over 3,500 years. That is a span of time that remains hard to hold in mind against the scale of most other human historical experience. Egypt's reputation as a land of astonishing antiquity and accumulated wisdom was already well established among its Mediterranean neighbors long before the final closing of its temples. This is reflected vividly in the account left by the Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled through Egypt in the 5th century BCE, several centuries before the country's absorption into the Roman world. He devoted an entire lengthy section of his histories to describing its monuments, customs, and history as he understood them from Egyptian priests and guides. Herodotus was writing at a moment when the pyramids of Giza were already well over 2,000 years old, far more ancient to him than his own account is to a modern reader today. He marveled at their scale. With a mixture of genuine curiosity and occasional credulity, he reported various stories about their construction, stories that Egyptian tradition had, by his time, already reshaped a good deal from whatever historical reality lay behind them. This pattern of later visitors encountering Egyptian monuments as already ancient, already partly mysterious even to local informants, and already the subject of accumulated legend, would repeat itself again and again across the following centuries. Roman-era tourists left graffiti recording their visits to sites like the Colossi of Memnon near Thebes. Medieval Arab scholars studied and wrote extensively about Egypt's monuments and, in some cases, its still only partially understood hieroglyphic inscriptions. And eventually came the wave of European scholarly and popular fascination that followed Napoleon's Egyptian campaign at the very end of the 18th century. That fascination, following the decipherment of hieroglyphic script made possible by the Rosetta Stone, finally allowed ancient Egypt to speak again after many centuries of silence, largely in its own words, rather than solely through the accounts of outside observers. Napoleon's expedition deserves a closer look for how directly it shaped this modern rediscovery. Alongside the roughly 38,000 soldiers who accompanied the French invasion of Egypt in 1798, traveled a team of some 160 scholars, artists, engineers, and scientists. They were organized into a body called the Commission of Sciences and Arts. Its task was to survey, measure, draw, and document Egypt's monuments, natural history, and contemporary society with a thoroughness no earlier European expedition had attempted. The resulting publication, the multi-volume Description de l'Égypte, was produced over the following 2 decades. It combined detailed engravings of temples, tombs, and inscriptions with extensive scientific and historical commentary, introducing the full scope of pharaonic monuments to a European readership for the first time in a systematic, richly illustrated form. Historians of the discipline generally credit its publication as marking the effective birth of Egyptology as a distinct field of organized scholarly study, separate from the more casual antiquarian curiosity that had characterized earlier European engagement with Egypt's past. It was a junior officer attached to this same expedition who, in 1799, recognized the significance of a broken slab of dark stone uncovered during fortification work near the town of Rosetta, its surface covered in 3 distinct blocks of script. That discovery set in motion the chain of scholarly effort that would culminate, more than 2 decades later, in Champollion's decipherment. It was a discovery whose ultimate significance the soldiers who found it, absorbed in the practical business of building a fort, could hardly have anticipated. What survived, long after the temples fell silent and the last priests capable of reading hieroglyphic script passed away, was something far harder to erase than any single dynasty or any single temple. Those priests took with them a skill that would not be recovered until the decoding of the Rosetta Stone in the early 19th century finally reopened direct access to the civilization's own written voice. What endured instead was an enormous physical and cultural legacy, scattered across the Nile Valley and, through trade and artistic influence, across the wider ancient and modern world alike. The pyramids at Giza were already ancient tourist attractions by the time Greek and Roman visitors began recording their own impressions of them. They remain, of all humanity's surviving monumental structures, among the very few built in the earliest stages of complex civilization that still stand largely intact today. They form a direct physical link across roughly 4,500 years to the organizational capacity, the religious conviction, and the sheer collective ambition behind them. It was a civilization that grew, sustained itself, and repeatedly renewed itself along the banks of a single, unusually reliable river for a length of time very few human societies before or since have ever managed to match. That work of recovery, moreover, has never really stopped. Archaeologists continue to uncover new tombs, new settlements, and new fragments of papyrus that quietly revise the picture assembled by generations of earlier scholars. Ongoing excavation of workers' villages continues to refine understanding of how monumental construction was actually organized. Periodic discoveries of previously unknown burials occasionally rewrite the accepted sequence of minor rulers whose reigns had otherwise left barely a trace in the historical record. Modern imaging technology has added a further layer. Computed tomography scanning of mummified remains requires no unwrapping or physical disturbance of the body at all. It has let researchers examine the health, diet, and cause of death of individual Egyptians, kings and commoners alike, with a level of detail unavailable to any earlier generation of scholars. DNA analysis has begun, cautiously and with appropriate scientific restraint, given the technical challenges of working with genetic material this old, to clarify some of the family relationships among royal mummies that inscriptions alone had left ambiguous or disputed. Each new find is a reminder that this civilization, for all the density of its surviving monuments and texts, remains only partially understood. Its full history is still being assembled, generation by generation, From evidence, the sands of the Nile Valley continue, even now, to yield up. Consider, for a moment, the scale of that duration set against more familiar historical reference points. The gap separating the builders of the Great Pyramid from Cleopatra, the ruler with whom popular imagination most often associates ancient Egypt, is longer than the gap separating Cleopatra herself from the present day. It is a fact that tends to reorganize, for anyone who sits with it, an otherwise flattened mental picture of the ancient world into something with real depth and an internal history of its own. This was an unbroken civilization, one that experienced its own periods of golden achievement and its own periods of decline. It saw its own moments of religious reform and religious restoration, its own foreign conquerors absorbed, resisted, or in several cases quietly outlasted, long before Rome or Greece or the Persian Empire had entered its story at all. What endured through all of this change was not any single dynasty or any single religious settlement. It was a set of underlying convictions about order, continuity, and the proper relationship between the living, the dead, and the divine. Those convictions proved durable enough to survive foreign conquest, internal fragmentation, and centuries of gradual transformation, inscribed patiently, generation after generation, into stone that has, in more than one remarkable case, simply refused to disappear.